Let's talk about ink line quality and the beautiful comic book art that's out there. Let's take a look at some things. So, inking and line quality go hand in hand, and it's a way to create really beautiful art with just two colors, black and white. The way you make your line quality really depends on your tools. And it's really interesting, I think, the challenge of crafting and creating different textures, different line quality, different things with very similar strokes. But in the way that you lay those strokes on paper does a lot to create that information, that expression. So it's really beautiful to me that with a few simple brush strokes of a brush pen, you can craft, what is this little woodland scene, but you do it with very specific and textured marks on the paper. So you get the tooth of the paper that picks up the ink, a little bit of a dry brush technique, and then you see kind of the absence of line in the negative space. I just love that. So um, you can use all different kinds of ink pens to achieve this effect on paper. Of course, microns are really popular, a nice disposable brand that you can use. I myself tend to pick a small, medium, and a large pen, which usually translate to somewhere around 0.1 or 0.5 or 0.8. That's what I typically use for my line quality when I'm working on paper. Of course, there are other brushes and techniques you can use. The nib is always fun with a bottle of ink, and trying out different chisel nibs and different shapes to craft and create those fill-in lines. Calligraphy is a lost art, and it's very interesting to try to do that with a chisel brush or a chisel pen, I mean. And then learning to brush with a pen, learning to ink with a brush is also a fun experience. You can get really fast with that brush. And if you have control over that line quality, you get a lot of interesting things. And then the way the flat brushes work and watercolor can be used, watercolor techniques can be used in black and white. It's a very interesting and cool process. Looking back at some artists that I admire that I think are the best inkers, I think of Jeff Smith and his Bone series, which was all handmade by him. The story was written and illustrated by him and produced, self-published for, I believe, like a 10-year period. He worked on it, independently publishing each issue and selling it on his own until ultimately he was able to collect it into a large series with Scholastic. I think they now have colored versions of the book, but ultimately, when it's all together, it's like 1,000 pages. It's just a beautiful story and then an amazing work of art that he was able to accomplish. And if you look closely at his work, it's a handcrafted, hand inked art. And if you look at it, I love the density of it. I mean, look at this action scene, which is very difficult to illustrate under any circumstance, but to be able to craft and separate the characters from, the dust cloud to the fur to all the different things going on, each one takes a little care with the limited line to craft that and create it. Notice how things that are closer to us have larger, thicker lines. Things that are further away or less important are thinner and lighter. And then there's a very cool control that he's got over those lines. And so the majority of it is done with a brush pen, and then a nib for some of the more straight lines. Really cool. Just love looking at his art that way. Now, Jeff Smith, as I understand it, was inspired by Walt Kelly, who did a comic strip called Pogo years ago. I think it was, somewhere in the, 50s, 60s, 70s that it was published. And it was a whole cast of interesting swamp characters that lived in this wooded forest, and they had their adventures. His style, you can see, is very inspirational to what Jeff Smith had done with Bone. Also, you can see in this close up, maybe you can see some of the light, subtle blue lines that are there. So you can see the underlying drawing that was done on the panel before it was inked, whether it's the the guidelines that are used for the lettering or some of the rough sketch marks that were done for the characters. Always loved this too, this soft line, the angle, and the handmade quality that really is, you know, really is representative of this time period in comic strip art. Another inspiration, another great inker and cartoonist to look at is Carl Barks, who had a really long legacy of working on Donald Duck in the Disney characters. Um, he's synonymous with Donald Duck when it comes to the comic strips. His caricaturization, I don't think that's a word, but his version of Donald Duck was very instrumental and very influential in the design of Donald and the characters. And so all of that cartooning was done by Carl Barks. Just a great talent with exquisite line quality and design and pacing in those old comics. A great inspiration to today's version of the DuckTales that you find in animation. I've always loved how the DuckTales has evolved over time, and it's cool to see where that line quality, that legacy of art by Carl Barks and others, where it is today. Too bad that show got canceled, I guess. Now, drawing and inking. Let's talk about that a little bit. What's the process? Well, typically, when working on paper, an artist would use a blue pencil. They call it a blue line, where you would sketch out the drawing in that light blue color and you wouldn't worry too much about erasing. And with that blue color, you could ink on top of that blue, not having to erase. And then later, when the art was photographed, those blue lines would disappear. Here's another version of that. You can kind of see that light blue, which disappears in the photographing process. So that solid, dense black line can be transferred to a printing plate for printing on newsprint. And that was done for decades. And I really love that the technology of printing and, photographing art through comics is what led to that style that we try to recapture digitally, which, doesn't have quite the exact flavor that you had when you worked on paper, especially the kind of the anxiety of making a mistake. If you make a mistake, you got to go back in and paint over with white, use some sort of whiteout, and then do it again. I One of the things I do love doing at Comic-Con is looking at original comic book panels and seeing the mistakes. That makes me feel good to see, oh yeah, those artists actually made mistakes, but they were able to fix them by hand. Nowadays, I know artists work in a variety of methods. I myself work on a iPad, and I work in the same uh, step-by-step process. I make a blue line, I make an ink layer, then I color. Some artists, what they'll do is they'll pencil digitally, and then they'll print out on cardstock their pencil lines in blue, and then ink so they can have an inked piece of art to sell or to share. And I kind of like that. When you're working 100% digitally, you don't have a piece of art to share or sell. And so it's nice maybe to step back a little bit and say, okay, I'm going to make some of this digital work handmade again. Of course, another great inking process is taking your drawings into Illustrator and then using vector lines to create those black and white lines. I actually really, really love vector art, and I love the line quality that you create with that smooth, crisp, clean line. There's nothing like it. And so for me, having that control, making a very precise line is really, I don't know, I guess I'm OCD about it. I really like that. So that has led to that vector style that I really like, where you're really controlling every little bit of that line quality, which isn't just about, your hand quality. It's actually, can you use that darn pen tool and make those smooth lines? Of course, I've already mentioned working in Procreate is a lot of fun, and being able to experiment with those different brushes and playing around with that process. Despite that fact, I still like to mimic what it was like working on paper. So, to finish up, I want to explain my 5 attributes of good inking line quality. So, what are the things that I look for that tell me that that art is really well made and is really attractive? It really kind of catches your attention. So, let's go through them. Number 1, variation in line weight. Seems obvious, or maybe it doesn't, but if you just use one pen and outline something in black, you're going to get one solid line, especially if you're working in Illustrator as well, when you're just working that one line, right? The way around that is to either use a brush where you can press and express that line with pressure, or maybe you go over that line again with a thicker pen and then you emphasize certain areas. If you're looking at this apple, you can see that by changing the density of that line, the thickness, you kind of create the impression of a darker side and a lighter side. You give that object a feeling of dimension, even though it's completely flat. And so it plays with the optical illusion and the style and the feeling of the art. So definitely enhance your line quality. Here's another beautiful panel by Jeff Smith, which is, a smorgasbord of line quality, right? Thick, thin, small, large, and then dense, where you have this foreground element that's completely black. That's cool. And I love how that plays with our perception of depth. And in a 2D, flat surface, you've created the appearance of that depth and perspective, all with just varying the line quality. Next essential element is consistency and control. And so you have to have a steady hand. You have to be able to control where your line is going, or you have to have a really steady mouse if you're clicking around on the pen tool. Here's an example of a vector drawing with that line quality where you can see they have very precise control. All the lines join. There's a perfect smoothness to the lines, and there's a thick and thin quality to it that you just can't beat with vector art. Then you can kind of look back at great art by Jack Kirby, inked by Joe Sinnott. Amazing stuff they did back then in the 60s and the 70s. Just beautiful, dense line art, all done with pen and ink. And, it's all the knowledge that they had gained for decades working tirelessly in comics and newspaper art. And then they took that and just exploded their imagination into this Kirby crackle and what you see. I love that. So Joe Sinnott, Ink and Kirby, can't beat it. Clarity and readability. That's kind of the challenge in your inking is okay, with no shading, how do I indicate and differentiate things on my panel? So you got to work really hard to determine what to put in and what to leave out. So here's a good example. Spider-Man Joe Quesada. Look at that drawing and then look at that inking. Love it so much. And there's a decision, a deliberate decision to enhance the shadows and then leave other areas open, which presumably would be filled in later in coloring. But I love that style, just seeing that dark, dense shadow connect all through his rib cage and down his side. It's a really cool process, and it's something that generally you just see in superhero comics. Love it. And then the light lines and the detail lines of the webbing and the other details on his costume. Love it. Great Spider-Man. Also, here's Bruce Timm, one of my all-time favorite cartoonists, the designer of the Batman series and the Justice League series, the 90s cartoons. To me, he had a way of simplifying characters into these dynamic figures while exaggerating their features, but at the same time creating a really cool character design. Love it. And in Batman in particular, he's able to really, leave in and leave out things in a really beautiful way. I love that. Love that solid black in his cape, and then kind of the open area where there would be a bright spot. Even to the caricature of his hand, I love that, and the swooping lines of his legs and his feet. Love it so much. Really dynamic. Okay, beyond being very clear with your line, you have to be expressive too. You know, let it express the feeling and the character of the object you're drawing. So here's just a random example of an inked drawing where you see a variety of line just expressing, both the expression on the face, but also just the detail of the shape of the face, the detail of the hair and the ears. And it's just a fun little process to create that line art. One of my all-time favorites, Walt Simonson, can't beat Thor, Beta Ray Bill, and all the above. Really taking on the legacy of Kirby and others and creating very dynamic and expressive art. I mean, the depth and everything that's going on in this piece is so awesome. You got Thor coming right at you, all the background shapes and objects and beautiful things happening, all the lightning and the crackle and all that. Cool. Really cool. So while it is busy, it's a very busy drawing, but it's beautiful too, just in the detail. Love it. Last but not least, creating depth and dimension in your art and being able to use, again, black and white to do that. This is a very subtle example, but you can see how on one side you have just one solid line, and on the other, the objects have a little bit of a thick and thin quality to those lines. That really sets it apart and gives the optical illusion of depth and dimension. Here's a great Frank Miller composition. I mean, look at that. From above, we've got this jail cell, and the character just alone, defeated, and every line, that abstract line, just points toward it. And there's so much in that direction and depth that's created with those lines. I love how it's kind of half there and half not there, but you still see it. So cool how it's a perfect use of black and white to make that character and isolate that character in the space. Also, just the texture of the suit, the jumpsuit he's wearing, all that, just the subtle details, the lines on the floor, it all works to express that depth and that optical illusion that that character is alone, you know? Just think of the camera angle too. Just alone, lost, defeated, cool. So that's a little bit of what I think about inking and how it can make really beautiful and dynamic art, whether you're using ink pens and paper or using digital tools on Procreate. I think we're still striving to do the same thing, trying to create that dynamic art in a way that's interesting and cool. And even though we're not worried about printing in black and white anymore, I still think it's nice to do that, to make that a style. All right. See you later. Love to see what you do.